In this lesson, what we're going to do is focus on one of the most controversial aspects of Mao's regime, which is that of the Great Leap Forward, or his second five-year plan. Now, what we're going to do in this lesson is look at the industrial policy that focuses on the Great Leap Forward, and we will just explain what the Great Leap Forward is in this lesson. And we'll do a bit of an assessment of the Great Leap Forward in the next lesson when we ask the question of whether or not it was a success. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. And we will talk about the broader context and the broader historical context that the Great Leap Forward ought to be placed in. Because don't forget, we have two different things running alongside each other during this period. We have the desire on the part of Mao to create this collectivization policy in terms of agriculture and to create these people's communes and to create and establish this particular the abolishment of private ownership of land and all these different things, alongside the fact that we also have the industrial policy. We have the first five-year plan, which was arguably pretty successful in terms of what it had achieved and what it was aiming to achieve. There were some disparaging elements of it, the fact that there was probably a lack of quality as the quantity of production was increasing. But for the most part, the first five-year plan was generally successful. And so the question we have to ask is, why was the Great Leap Forward so unsuccessful? Why was it the case that if we have the first five-year plan, which was relative success in terms of production, why is it that we see a dramatic decrease in the amount of production under the Great Leap Forward? We'll also focus on the motivations for the Great Leap Forward, as well as the implications of such a policy. So, there were a number of socio-political and also international motivations for the launching of the second five-year plan. Now, this is called the Great Leap Forward. You can use those phrases interchangeably. Just the Great Leap Forward is what it is most famously known as. And the industrial success of the first five-year plan would be weighed down by the disappointing agricultural output that took place during the same period. So like I said, you can't detach these two elements to get apart, because essentially we have the agricultural elements, and Mao believed that what ought to take place is that the agricultural side of the economy should be as productive as possible in order to feed the industrial workforce. Mao wanted to improve those who are working in the urban environments and who are working in industrial work by the output and production of agriculture. And the main driving factor for economic production that Mao really did want to utilize was the fact that there was a large labor supply. That was the general positive element of the Chinese economy at the time. They may not have had the most up-to-date technological resources. They may not or necessarily have the best economic policy, let's just say, from an ideological perspective, but they had one thing that gave them a lot of major success over other countries, which is the fact that they had a large labor supply, and so they could utilize this large labor supply. But one of the problems with the large labor supply, at least in terms of Mao's beliefs, was that Mao believed himself that mass mobilization of workers and quote-unquote revolutionary spirit would be able to overcome any of the major issues that were had in the economy and build a successful communist state. He essentially believed that, regardless of the technological impairments, regardless of the ideological difficulties of trying to implement collectivization and trying to implement communism, what would actually be successful for the economy would be for all of us just to work harder and to mobilize a workforce, and for us to just keep going and keep pushing, and that is what's going to drive economic output, which is essentially what the Great Leap Forward even was in the first place. So Mao looked towards the USSR for inspiration of his own economic prosperity, and you'll notice that a lot of this earlier period under Mao's regime was influenced by the USSR, the Soviet Union. Because in 1957, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev made a speech in which he argued that the USSR would overtake the United States in terms of industrial production by the year of 1980. So he was making quite bold declarations about the economic prosperity of the USSR and the extent to which it will overtake the capitalist counterpoint, the capitalist rival, that being the USA. Now, in terms of the context in which that speech was made, and in terms of the time in which it was made, and if we take away the hindsight that we now have when in relation to the Cold War, it would seem that this was a relatively promising proposition, because at this point in 1957, the communists were arguably being very successful in terms of their winning of the Cold War, if you can call any of it winning. So we see, for example, the growing importance of the space race, and the USSR was outperforming the USA, on the space race. Arguably, the USSR won the space race in terms of achievements. If you take a list of all the achievements of the USA and all the achievements of the Soviet Union in regards to the space race, you have the USSR having more. They would launch the first satellite, they launched the first animal into space, they launched the first person into space. I believe they had the first person go around the moon, and then the USA essentially tried to end the space race by just sending people to the moon. So you have like the kind of almost like the Western propaganda myth that the USA won the space race. Arguably, the USSR had more substantial achievements in terms of interspace exploration. Regardless, at the time they were winning the space race. We see the launching of Sputnik that same year in 1957, which was the first satellite into space. And Mao wants to engage further in this rhetoric. Mao wants to sort of join in with this kind of rhetoric in relation to the winning of the Cold War. They claim that we must start a technological revolution so that we may overtake Britain in 15 years or more. You can see the similarities between Khrushchev's language and between Mao's language in this regard. At a speech in 1957, I believe it was in Moscow, Mao declared that the east wind is prevailing over the west. Again, further inclinations as to the success of the communist powers in the Cold War, and the success and the belief that would have been had at the time that communism really was truly the most successful and most promising economic mode of production, compared that to the failing of capitalism. And so therefore they were very confident. Khrushchev was confident. Mao was confident. There was confidence in other communist states as more and more states began to fall to the growth of communism in China and in Eastern Europe and in Latin America. Further adding to this confidence was the fact that the communist leaders were winning the Cold War, as well as another motivation was that there wasn't any real indication that Mao had any kind of opposition to any of his policies. So generally speaking, when you have a system of government, you will have some kind of opposition and critique of every single thing that you do in order to be able to effectively analyze what the policies are that are being implemented. But since the anti-rightist campaign that we've already looked at, where a number of key prominent intellectual figures were sent to the Laogai system, there was no longer any political opponents in Mao's way, allowing him to essentially go about implementing agricultural and industrial policy without any opposition. Now, there would eventually grow certain disparities in terms of opposition within the Communist Party as the Great Leap Forward was shown to be a proven failure, and as the Great Famine kills tens of millions of people. And that's when we see the Lushan Conference, and we see Mao take a step back from his day-to-day runnings of government. And so this sort of cult of personality that is existing at the moment around Mao won't last for too much longer, but then it will come back again when we start to analyze how Mao implemented and came back into the day-to-day politics when we talk about the Cultural Revolution. So during the Great Leap Forward itself, industrial firms were taken over and formulated into state-owned enterprises. The implications of this were as follows. So instead of there being a market that would set production targets, the central government and the CCP would set production targets for the output of those particular factories and industrial firms. Wages were set by the party, workers were given housing as well as essential elements of life, such as education and healthcare. Managers were not incentivized to work for efficiency since there was no market, so they were essentially just trying to set, or at least meet, the production targets that had been put in place by the CCP itself. And the result of all of this was the overworking of the labour supply and the the reduction in industrial output due to the fact that there was a lack of agricultural output. So there was people who were then beginning to starve as a result of the problems within the policy. And then you also have the fact that they were running out of supplies to create all of the industrial production that was set by the CCP, to the point where we start to see backyard furnaces begin to take place, something that we'll look at in the next lesson.